Hello, welcome. For those of you watching us live, I will give you a second here to sign on. And for those of you watching in the future, I want to thank you for your interest in Hail Mary, the rise and fall of the National Women's Football League. Before I welcome our two authors, I would like to begin by telling you a bit about the Country Bookshop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina. We are unique in that we are a bookstore that is part of a small community, twice weekly award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. We are a general bookstore for kids and adults that is part of a community that chooses to shop with us and share their stories and lives with us and celebrate the people who take a bit of history and carve it out on the page and give us such an illuminated vision like the two women who are here with us today. I would like to welcome Brittany De La Creda, who is a freelance writer whose work sits at the intersection of sports, gender, culture, and queerness. Their writing is a mix between reported journalism and creative nonfiction, and they teach writing classes at Grub Street. They are the former sports columnist for Long Reads, as well as the former sports and culture columnist for Bitch Media. Their work has been featured in the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, Vogue, The Washington Post, Teen Vogue, Bleacher Report, The Ringer, The Atlantic, ESPNW, Elle, Marie Claire, and many others. Lindsay D'Arcangelo writes about women's college basketball and the WNBA for The Athletic. Her articles, columns, and profiles on female LGBTQ plus athletes have previously appeared in The Ringer, Deadspin, ESPNW, ESPN, Teen Vogue, The Buffalo News, The Huffington Post, NBC Out, and more. She received a notable mention in the 2018 Best American Sports Writing Anthology for her story, My Father, Trump, and the Buffalo Bills. Lindsay is joining us today from Buffalo, New York. And welcome. Thank you both for being here. I reached out as soon as I heard about this book. I buy months and months ahead of time and have been really looking forward to this conversation. And before I get into a question, I'm going to just set the scene with two paragraphs of a quote from the beginning of the book, just to set everybody up. These women came from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, largely from working class homes. They were gay and straight. They were factory workers and mothers. They were beauticians and truck drivers. They overcame sexism, injuries, exhaustion, stereotypes, harassment, skeptics, and their own lack of training to become the first women's pro football league in U.S. history. This is the story of the girl gritters who took America by storm, the women of the NWFL. The league itself was a Hail Mary pass, a long shot, something with a high likelihood of failure. It's the pass you take because why the hell not? Because the ball is in your hands, and if you don't do it, the chance for success goes from slim to none. The Hail Mary that was the NWFL may not have been a completed pass, but for a while, as it sailed through the air towards its receiver, it looked like it had a shot. And I'd like to open up our conversation just for each of you to take a moment to tell one story that just either stuck with you, or when you found out about it, like you just had to tell everybody. You were like, did you know? Or I talked to this woman, or I found this article, or, an outrage or anything else that just immediately jumps in your mind that took its hold of you during this process.
Gosh, there's so many. I guess one thing that still, stuck out to me and is cool because it's a local connection for me, being from Buffalo, New York, and I follow the Bills. Have always been a Buffalo Bills fan. My entire family is, but I covered a team called the LA Dandelions, and one of the players, a linebacker by the name of Barbara Patton, used to bring her son Marvcus to practices and games. She brought all of her children, but they especially bonded over football, and he learned the game from watching her play. And he actually grew up to be an NFL player for the Buffalo Bills in the early 90s. And he thanks his mom for pretty much putting him on that path, and so just to have that narrative where it's a son who learns about football from his mother and then ends up following her footsteps to become a linebacker, professional linebacker, is pretty amazing.
I think like there's a lot, but if I think about the moment that I got really excited about what this book could be beyond just football and the kinds of stories that we were going to get to tell, was really early on in the reporting process for me. And it was when I found out that the Dallas Bluebonnets team had kind of formed in a lesbian bar. Um, and I think that was a facet of the league that we were hopeful that we would be able to talk to players about, but we didn't know how open they were going to be. And when it became clear that a lot of them really did want to talk about the connections between queer culture and the queer spaces they were frequenting and the teams themselves and the way that they kind of all served as safe spaces at a time when the world wasn't as open. I think that was really exciting. And also, I'm a huge history nerd, and I just did not anticipate going down this rabbit hole into 1970s Dallas lesbian bar culture, like a very, very niche rabbit hole that I did not expect to go down. And it was so interesting. And so I think it was just, yeah, it was the first time I saw the breadth of what kind of research we could be doing with this project.
That's pretty cool. Well, how did each of y'all come to the project and meet each other? Let's start at that origin of.
You want me to answer that one, Linz?
Yeah, you tell it best.
So Lindsay and I met in a Facebook group for sports writers of marginalized genders and became friends. And we were friendly as freelancers working from home. We would just like chat throughout the day. And Lindsay writes about football and watches football and has played football. And I don't cover the sport and don't know a ton about it. It is not one of my primary beats. And I was working on a column for Bitch about the kind of modern state of the women's game. And I was looking for a book to add historical context and to kind of get grounded in like what was the arc for how we got to where we are today with the women's game. And there just really wasn't anything that I wanted to read. There was one women's football encyclopedia, which is incredible, but that's really an attempt to kind of do nuts and bolts, like statistics keeping and to have documentation of the games and the records. And I wanted something meatier than that, and it just did not exist. And I was complaining to Lindsay about how like the only books I could find were these really sexist books that assumed that women might want to watch football only to like hang out with their boyfriend or husband on Sunday. And so she told me, well, it sounds like you're going to have to write it. And I said, then you're going to write it with me. And it was a joke. And then we got agented for this project. I will say that this book was not our original attempt. We tried to sell a proposal that was much broader about the history of women in football very generally, and it didn't sell. But in the course of researching that proposal, we found this league. And when we realized how undercovered it had been, it became really apparent that this was the book that we needed to write, particularly while these women were still alive and could tell us about it.
Yeah, you talk in the book about the coverage at the time and how it was almost like the story was disappearing as it was even happening. And I've spent a lot of time looking at your bibliography, and it's so much of the research, it seems like, was looking into what media coverage there was, then newspaper story after newspaper story. Can you talk a little bit about what you uncover? And I have like 3 sub questions that I'm just going to throw at you, and then y'all can, choose your own adventure. But just, I thought it was really interesting. The first article that you mentioned, talking about women's football with integrity, was written by a woman, Renee Siva from the Chicago Tribune. You also mentioned like Nancy Woodhull, and then you talk about one male reporter who did a good job from the Houston Post, David Cass Stevens. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. But I'm wondering, and then at the same time, there's also Women's Sports Magazine that you're talking about, and Title IX kind of happening right there. There's this whole mix, and I'm wondering if you could kind of talk to any path on that, but really your research and the news specifically.
Well,
around.
the three articles you mentioned, I wrote that part about during the chapter of media miscues is what you're referring to.
Okay.
I was familiar with those articles, and I found they were really well done features, and they focused on the player and their talent and the sport,
Mhm.
and who they were as human beings. And you didn't see that a lot. You saw a lot of patronizing and satire and scrutiny. Was probably scrutiny about them playing football, about their poor performance, how they protected their breasts, like all of these different avenues that were focused on besides their actual like play and team and personal stories. So that was the predominant. So I wanted to highlight those three features that you mentioned because they were far and few between, but they were so notable because had more articles like that been written, I think you would have seen a different perception of this league and how it was portrayed. And in the beginning, it was a novelty. It was a curiosity, women playing professional football, and especially at a time, like you mentioned, with Title IX, where women hadn't really participated in sports or hadn't been able to, or allowed in certain institutions. So, all of that played into the part where the media was into it at first, in the first, few years of the league. But as it went on, especially into the 80s, we had a really hard time finding anything written about them. Um, Game coverage, gamers as we call them, um, features like the ones I mentioned, like they just dwindled. So, you did have the media coverage initially, but the majority of it was not done in good faith.
Yeah, and I would add to that something that came up while I was talking to some of the women is they would mention the media coverage, and I'd talk to them about how they felt about the way their team was covered. And many of them felt they couldn't really complain because they were grateful to be covered at all. But also they said that some of the stuff that was written or that they were attributed as having said, like they never said. Or the quotes that are there are clearly answers to these very leading questions that were asked through like the frame of reference of the person writing. So they're continuously asked things about whether they're supporters of the women's liberation movement. They're asked what their presumed male partners think of them playing football. They're asked how it affects their weight, lots of stuff about their diet and their weight and keeping their weight down. Things like that are very clearly through the lens of the person who's reporting the story and kind of the angle that they're coming from. And I think what's really interesting, not just about the coverage of this league, but I think it brings up like questions about when you're doing archival research and you're going back to primary source documents of, we assume this is true because it's written in a paper, but how true and reliable is it, and how shaped is it by the time in which it's being written and the lens through which it's being told? And so I kind of like that there's this element where we say we're going to try our best to reconstruct this, and in some cases we have women who are able to correct the record, but also there's just a lot we're never going to know because of the ways in which it was documented.
Well, let's go back to that. I mean, can you talk a little bit about who you interviewed? There are two reunions, I think, that y'all mentioned in the book that happened in 2019. Can you talk about what the process was? I could be wrong. It could be one reunion, but thank you. Sorry about that. And one reunion happened in 2019. But what was your process of finding these women and your conversations with them? What was it like meeting them? What can you take us off the page a little bit into what those conversations were like?
The reunion, I will say, was, so it was the Houston Hurricanes 40-year reunion. I attended that because we were invited by the daughter of one of the players who's making a documentary about the team. It's called Brick House. So I will be featured in the documentary talking about the league itself. We did split the teams in half and kind of go from there and see where it led us. Lindsay actually wrote the sections on the hurricanes and was unfortunately not able to go to Houston. So I showed up at this reunion and I had no idea who anyone was. I hadn't talked to anybody. I was just really excited to be there. I now know who they all are because I have read Lindsay's portions of the book. But at the time, I didn't really, I'm sure it yeah. It's like, hi, I'm so excited to be here. I don't know who any of you are. Let me ask you a bunch of questions. Those were really the only players that we got to meet in person. And part of that is because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we were limited in terms of archives that were digitized online that we could access, or things that the players had in their attics and basements and closets. If they had newspaper clippings from non-digitized sources, we have those, but there are definitely gaps in what we were able to do because of that. But Linz, do you want to talk more about like how we found these people?
Yeah, I started before, but I forgot I had muted myself.
I know, I didn't hear you talking, so I just jumped
those are
in.
the brave. That's how Zoom goes sometimes. But yeah, so a lot of it was we kind of found out discovered a group of teams, and then split those teams up between us, because so we could each research separately, and then through the newspaper articles, you'd see names of players. So we'd pull out those names and then go on like a internet search for, any contact information we could find, whether it was through Facebook or just trying to track down relatives or phone numbers. And then we did a lot of cold calling and reaching out. And it was all about just trying to get them to realize that we were legitimate, and then trust in us to tell their story to us, and then open up. And most of the players were really made themselves accessible and really wanted to talk. There were a few here and there who needed a little prodding and a little bit of reassurance that we wanted to tell this story, their story, as honestly and openly and honorably as possible. And I think once the process really started, and we had multiple conversations with different players, like we spoke to them more than once, a lot of them, and they really just jumped in and became our biggest cheerleaders throughout this whole process, and are just really so warm and just and supportive and grateful, that someone is finally putting them front and center and saying, hey, you did something really important and we want to talk about it. We want to share it with the world. So yeah, we ended up talking to enough players to really fill in some gaps that the newspapers couldn't. As Brittany mentioned earlier, there's so much here. We say in the book, we covered as much as we possibly could, but we know there's things we may get wrong or that we may have left out, and we're hoping that other players will come forward as this book gets talked about, and share what's missing. Yeah, but it actually turned out to be one of the most rewarding parts of the process, is getting to know these players on a personal level and really making a connection with them.
Something that was really interesting to me, some of the players who had gotten a lot of media attention at the time, which were either because they were like feminine or conventionally attractive, and the players wanted to focus, and the papers wanted to focus on them, or a player like Linda Jefferson, who was the best player in the league, and we write about her quite a bit in the book. A lot of them, their only hesitance in speaking with us came from fear that their teammates wouldn't get credit, like had happened in the 70s. And they were very, very clear that they only wanted to speak to us if we promised to give their teammates the shine that they deserved. And they were like, I was only able to do what I did because my teammates did what they did. And yeah, we talked to some players multiple times, and then we had someone like Linda Jefferson, where I was like, we cannot write this book without talking to Linda, and I could not get a hold of her. 2 years I spent trying to get a hold of her, and I finally found her niece on Facebook and sent I'll use the word Hail Mary. That's what's coming to mind. I commented on a public post And weeks later, I happened to be on a writing retreat in an Airbnb in Salem, and I get an unknown call from Toledo, and I'm like, there's no way. And I pick up the phone, and she's like, hi, my name's Linda Jefferson, and I've heard you've been looking for me for a long time. And I was like, oh my God, that was my one shot. I had her for 2 hours, and we played phone tag when I tried to follow up, and some of the players were like that. You had one shot, and what you got was what you got. And that was great too. I'm just glad we got to connect with her.
I can only imagine living the decades, having that media attention of not even about what you were doing, and that's all that people saw, what that would do to your memories, and how tough that would be. When just talking about, like, for some of the players, the conversations you had, the warmth that was shared, that you could feel. And Lindsay, you mentioned that was like one of the best parts of writing the book, was feeling that. And it does come through that, you were talking about how interesting it was to understand the lesbian bar roots, but also how diverse the team was. And then you had the family-like atmosphere that happened. You talk about, it was sometimes people's first time hanging out with a lesbian or hanging out with somebody of a different race, but what everybody had in common was their working class backgrounds in general. Can you talk a little bit about what the team building was like, or what you discovered or heard from these women about the community that was created?
I think a lot of them were working class. Obviously some were not nothing is universal, right? But I actually think there was this other piece that really bonds the players. I think the game of football bonds people. They're, as teammates, you're going to bond because you're playing this very physical game together, and you are essentially going to war with your teammates out on the field, and you have to trust those people to have your back. And if one person doesn't do what they're supposed to do, the play doesn't work, right? And so there's this element of bonding that just happens naturally when you play the game of football. But in the case of these women, their differences fell away when it came to their ability to bond both on and off the field, because they had this shared experience of going up against, like, breaking societal norms together. They were kind of going up against the world together, and they were all doing this thing that none of them were told that they should be allowed to do. And so I think that also creates these very deep bonds in which you are like, let's break the rules together.
Yeah, I agree completely with that sentiment. And it, once they got out onto the football field and were trying to accomplish this singular goal of, learning the game and playing as a team, and then defeating the team across from them, you can't, that's the kind of bond that they'll always have. Some teams are, to this day, are still keep in touch, and others don't, but they will always have that.
And actually, something very cool about this is many players, I don't know, Linz, if you had this experience, but I had players who would be like, did you talk to this person? And if I said yes, they would be like, can I have their number? And before COVID happened, the Dallas Bluebonnets were talking about having their own reunion because this had all come up, and they had gotten back in touch with each other as a result of all having talked to me. And so I think part of this bringing up the memories also kind of rekindled some of those connections as well. Although I will say my favorite story about connections is that two of the Oklahoma City Dolls players, Charlotte Gordon and Doris Stokes, they currently play in a seniors basketball league together. They've been friends for like 60 years, and they are great. And I love that.
That is
awesome
pretty
tidbit.
cool. You talked about how the beginning of this, you realized one of your ways stumbling into this is there wasn't a history of female football. And I love playing football. And playing, my opportunities were all powder puff, and was very serious about it. And so were a lot of my friends, and so were the spectators. And can you take us back to November 21st, 1896? That's the like, and I was like, yeah, that's how it starts. And just tell that story for our audience, the powder puff, Yale, Princeton.
Yeah, I mean, it was an event for men. It was a male social club, and they thought it would be, just great fun to put some women out in the field and in pennies and have a good laugh, at them frolicking around the field. And what happened is when the ball was hiked, I mean, all of the girls on the field were like, "We're going all in," and they took it seriously. They wanted to play. This was their opportunity, and they played. And actually, it got so rough and physical that the police were called in to kind of break up, what they referred to as like a melee on the field. And the crowd of onlookers were so enthralled that they kept inching closer, and they got pushed back, and the whole thing had to be shut down because, like, God forbid that women get too physical and with sports. And but I mean, that's like what I found to be like the first instance of women having a chance to play and playing. But then you see throughout the entire history chapter of things like that, of women just making the most of the opportunities that they got when they did get them, and every time took it seriously and wanted to play and wanted to partake in a sport that I think is just so appealing for everyone, regardless of gender. But yeah, it's a great scene. It's a great visual, and it just is a great example of how men were shocked because that women would actually know how to play or want to play and actually take it seriously.
Yeah, and I think that, like Lindsay said, that's a theme. Like, even the NWFL started because a man thought that he would, Sid Friedman, as this promoter, thought he would start a team as a barnstorming venture, and he would make money putting them up against men's teams, and people might come and maybe there will be tearaway jerseys. He had no idea. He just thought it would be a spectacle. And then, to his surprise, the women showed up and were like, "You said football, let's go," right? Like, this is over and over again. Women show up, girls show up, they're given an opportunity. Often the opportunity is a joke, and the women show up anyway and try to play. And I kind of actually think, if you follow even that thread up until like the early aughts, and you have the Legends Football League, which a lot of people are familiar with as the Lingerie Football League, and they got all the TV sponsorships, and like, we can talk about that as a separate thing. But what I think that it has in common with what we see throughout history is, like, in that case, the women had to play in their underwear, and most of the women were willing to do it because it gave them the ability to play football at a high level, at a professional level. And so, a lot of the men who start the leagues want to make it a spectacle, and the women are sometimes willing to put up with it. But what you see is that they're going to do what they have to do in order to play the sport that they love.
Can you contrast Sid Freeman a little bit to Bob Matthews?
Oh yeah. So Sid, he, whatever his intentions were, he is a big part of the women in football history and story, and kind of set the groundwork unwittingly for the NWFL to take off. But he was always in it, for the money. And the difference with Bob Matthews is, yes, he wanted to make money off of this venture, but he also, it's evident that he cared about the players and he cared about his team, just in the way he was the owner of the LA Dandelions and also the president of the league when it started. But he provided travel expenses. He put them up in hotels. He paid for uniforms and helmets and whatever other expenses. I think the players on the Dandelions only had to pay for their cleats, as opposed to some other teams that didn't have an owner, that were player owned, or did have an owner that couldn't cover that stuff. So he genuinely cared, and he wanted to make this league into something akin to the NFL and see where it could go and expand to other cities, and really, he really saw a future for it. He really believed in it. And I think both him and Friedman did different ways of trying to promote it, with Friedman maybe taking a little bit more, the way he talked it up to the press, and told some exaggerations here and there, and didn't really care. For him, any press was good press, whether negative or positive. And Matthews wanted to do it on the up and up. He got offers for the LA Dandelions and to play against men's teams, and he never engaged, because it's like, no, this is we're doing this the right way. This isn't just for show. This is a legitimate league. And so he never, did anything at the expense of his players. So there you could see just the different motivations, and the way they treated their players was completely different. And I think it also, you could see the response with Friedman. You had a couple teams leave his his conglomerate and move over to the NWFL because of the way he treated them. And with Matthews, especially the Dandelions players, they talked him up like he was an amazing man, and they couldn't believe he was putting his own money up for them and doing this and that. There's a lot of respect there that you didn't see with Friedman and his players.
Can we go into the business of football a little bit more? Let me get to my notes here, but just the holding company model, and you talk about the financial disaster of the NFL, but people willing to be putting in more money in that just because of the societal belief structure. Can you break that down for people who might not be aware of just the back end business?
Sure.
And how that affected the league?
Yeah. So in order to start an NWFL team, the amount varied. It was somewhere between like $11,000 or to $14,000 that people were being asked as the kind of like the fee to be part of the league. And often that was bankrolled either by, a couple people, one or two people, like in the case of the Dallas Bluebonnets, it was Bob Matthews had two brothers in Dallas, and those Matthews brothers, they bought in that way. In other cities, you had folks have, several people from the community invest. And then you had other teams like the Houston Hurricanes that I don't think they ever actually paid the entrance fee, but in theory they were player funded, and the players were going to throw their money in. And then again, some teams started one way where community members or some coaches put money in, and then the players, bought themselves later on. But yes, the holding companies there were a couple different teams that had this holding company model in which a group of investors had put that money in, and then they owned the team. But the teams sustained themselves with ticket sales, which were like $3.50 for a ticket, and we're talking at the height 3,000 to 4,000 tickets a game. As the years went on, you're getting closer to like maybe 500 if you're lucky. Booster club, raffle tickets, community businesses were buying ad space and programs, really, really kind of cobbling together. Often players had to put their own money in, or, the men, the coaches, the owners that had started the team are also putting their money in. And what's interesting when you read about the motivations for a lot of the men who started teams is they thought, oh, women's football, a gap in the market, it's going to be the next NFL, we'll be raking in money within a few years. And not only did that not happen, it doesn't take into consideration like the standard trajectory of any sports league. Most sports leagues take at least a decade to ever see a profit, and many take even longer. We can look at, in the first 10 years of the NFL, 90% of the franchises that started folded. And that league continued to have people putting lots and lots, way more than $11,000 to start these franchises. And we draw this comparison to men's teams, even NFL teams. I think we use the Pittsburgh Steelers as an example in the book of just decades of putting like millions of dollars into a team that never turns a profit and never wins anything. And often it is because men see value in men's sports and they give it time. They give it time that women's sports never have. time to grow a fan base, because that's another thing. You don't just say we have a new team and everyone's going to come watch. Fan bases evolve over time. They're passed down from generation to generation. Like there's all of this stuff that goes into why it takes so long. And very, very often women's leagues are given a few years, and if they don't turn a profit or aren't overnight sensations, people pull out and aren't willing to invest the same kind of time and money into the growth as they are with men's leagues, which we often see them just throw money down the toilet year after year and see no return on.
Lindsay, do you have anything to add?
No, Brittany does a great job of explaining that that part of things. And, you know, I mean, all I could do is reiterate the same thing. You know, we see that now, like with the people, you know, hating on the WNBA and talk about how it's not even making money, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's only 25 years old. And if you go to the NBA 25 years old, you know, you're going to see them financially struggling. And, you know, I think they had just combined with the ABA, and we're hoping that would inject some excitement into. I mean, this time gap, you know, between what men's pro sports leagues are given and women's is it's really frustrating. You know, but we also live in a time where, you know, people want instant this and instant that, and you know, to expect a young professional women's sports league to be profitable or team right off the jump is ridiculous. But people forget that, you know.
You know, it's interesting because our audience locally, so we're in an area that's a super golf mecca destination, and Peggy Kirk Bell, who was one of the original female professional golfers, is from here, and she and her husband and kids started a resort here that's specified in teaching women how to play golf. And just by virtue of proximity, everybody who grows up here know what these women did, know how hard they work, know, you know, it's just part of our local walking around knowledge, and the amount of work that they did, but how visible they made themselves. And you talk in your book about, I'm going to read another quote. The rapid expansion can be credited to the increasing visibility of girls who play. If you see it, you can be it. And none of it would exist at all without the women of the NWFL paving the way. And just the increase of girls playing sports in general with Title IX is such a short period of time. And just like having the training to work as a team. Can you talk about the WNBA having this history, and can you just give us some context of female pro sports leagues, where we are now, you know, soccer, golf, basketball, football, just where this all fits? You know, this book does such an incredible snapshot of this one moment in time, and I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think Title IX was a huge, you know, it had its impact, right? I mean, I was just talking about the NBA compared to WNBA, and like when the NBA was like 25 years old, women weren't even allowed to play full court basketball yet. If you want to see the disparity, you know, visual like that, which is incredible. And then the WNBA didn't even start until the mid 90s. 1996 was when it was formed, and didn't tip off until 1997, you know. And think about all the male sports that were being played, you know, by then. You know, women's soccer, you know, didn't really catch on until the 90s, and they weren't even allowed to play in the Olympics, you know, or participate. There was no World Cup until like the 80s, late 80s, I believe. It's just, you think about just the slow trajectory of for women being able to play and participate and have their moments in sports, and how men have been doing it for eons. And you look back at the time period of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, medical doctors believe that if women overexerted themselves, they would get cancer, you know, or some of the players joke about it in the book, that they, if they got hit too hard, their uterus would fall out, stuff like that. It's just these ridiculous notions. And yes, we're in a different time period, but you still have that societal view that has yet to really catch up. It's been slow going, and you're seeing women getting the opportunity, especially professional athletes, using their platforms to advocate for more equality, whether it's just with the treatment of coaches, how the league is run, pay, more marketing deals, let them shine, let them get the commercials, invest in women, is a big saying these days, invest in women's sports. And it's great to see, but you have to, you look at the context, and it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think too, at the time that this league started, some of the teams started right before Title IX was passed. The league itself started just 2 years after Title IX was passed. Some of the players today still don't know. Like, if you ask them if Title IX impacted anything, they've never heard of Title IX. They don't know what it is. For players who are in school, we have a few, like Rose Lowe, who was the quarterback of the LA Dandelions. She was a college student at the time, and so her world opened up, and she was able to participate in collegiate sports. Jan Hines, the quarterback of the Oklahoma City Dolls, was part of the very first softball team under Title IX at the University of Oklahoma. And so for those players, it had a really big impact. But you think about these women, and as girls, they didn't have any opportunity to even play like organized sports. There was so little, any skill they had, they developed in like sandlots and playing pickup games with their brothers and like neighborhood boys. And boys are going to little league practice or, Pop Warner or whatever it is, and getting actual instruction. And the girls, the girls are learning from what their brothers are learning. And so you have this skill gap because we have not had girls being given the opportunity, the resources, the infrastructure to build the skills. So even the skill level was different, not because the women weren't capable, but because they weren't being taught fundamentals from the time they were little in the ways that boys were.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, we even talk about one of the coaches of the LA Dandelions admitting, the first year he coached the team, that he only taught them a small portion of the playbook because he wasn't sure how much they could absorb. And then after that season, he's like, that's my mistake, like, for underestimating them. And he opened it wide up, after that. But that again goes to the stereotype and this, like I said, societal view that, women are incapable of being, intellectually able to understand and play football and get the fundamentals, and let alone actually perform on the field. It's just there was a lot that these women had to prove, so many different aspects, that I don't think they anticipated, and then just gave them more, I don't want to say encouragement, but gave more motivation is a better word to prove that they could do all of these things.
It's some of our customers who will be watching this video are familiar with some of our other authors that we've talked to, and in specific, I will be linking in the show notes to a chat with the Real Women of Ashley's War. Ashley's War being a book about the first female special forces attachment teams, and interviewing 3 of these women after they retired. And it is, 10 years ago, in a very similar story, and what these women faced in that arena moving forward. But I'd love to continue with this context of this league within our, y'all are both professionals writing in the women's sports space. Can you take us to where we are now? Just a long-eyed view of female football right now?
Yeah, so there are amateur leagues out there. There's not a professional women's football league, but there are a handful of amateur leagues, and you know, they're all functioning on their own. Some are more successful than others, and the problem is that they're all also fighting for the same. They're trying to pull from the same pool of fans and investment and marketing and promotion, and so there's sort of less to go around. And then one of the things we talk about in the book is what could be helpful, what could change, because you're seeing these leagues struggle with the same issues that the NWFL did back in the 70s. And so we're in 2021 and they're still dealing with the same issue, like from lack of media coverage, kind of lack of respect, lack of fans, lack of televised games. So we try to address that, and one of the things that some people from the different leagues talk about is possibly getting together and forming one league where they could pool all their resources together and then build off of that. And you know, also you'd have the best talent instead of that spread around these leagues. You'd have it in one league as well. And Brittany has a great way of framing this as well and can speak more on this, but there's also this perception, I think, when it comes to football that you don't see with women's soccer and women's basketball, is that football is such a very masculine sport, you know, that I think our society still has a hard time wrapping their mind around women playing it, especially tackle, especially so physical, and that, and how that kind of has, you know, influenced the lack of growth or the lack of appeal, I guess, for modern day women's football.
Yeah, I one thing I think about is, as I was writing this book and we learn about the Toledo Troopers, who they are the winningest pro football team in history, men's or women's. They have been deemed such by the Hall of Fame. And I was thinking about how they're not very well known, like outside of certain circles. And I think there's this perception that, like, oh, if this was happening today, if there was a team that was this good, we would know about it. And there are football teams that are this good, and particularly there's a women's football team in Boston where I live, the Boston Renegades, who just won their third championship in a row, who, like, the Patriots owner, like Robert Kraft, lent his charter plane so they could go to their championship game, and calls them, you know, a dynasty as well. And they're still live streaming their games on Facebook and paying the women are still paying to play the game and working full-time jobs, and they're like doing merch and concession sales at games and having community partners chip in. Like, literally the Troopers had a booster club, and so do the Renegades. Like, it's so little has changed but I'm hopeful that we have the motivation and the momentum. I guess I would rather say the momentum that we're seeing behind a lot of professional women's sports. And I do hope that football is next. But I do think football and baseball are kind of the two sports that women have historically and like systemically been kept out of. And I think that that's part of why it's taken so long to get momentum behind a pro league either one of those sports.
So as people come to this book and have the opportunity to be familiar about the long history of women playing football, what's their next step to support these teams and to, you know, direct their attention to women's football in different ways?
Well, most major cities in the country have a women's like semi-pro team. I think the WFA, the Women's Football Alliance, is the largest current pro league, but there are others. But almost every major city has a team, and I think people would be shocked if they went on and Googled their city and women's football team to find that there are teams that are playing right there that you can support right now. And I think that that is probably the best way, is to just like get out and support the teams and the players so that they can continue to build on this, because I think people don't even realize, like, yes, this is history, but it's still, the women's game exists today and is just as robust, if not more so, as it was then.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I would just like to hand it over to each of you. If there is an aspect of the book that you really want to highlight or that we have not touched upon, or if something you want anybody listening to this conversation to walk away with, and I would love for each of you to have an opportunity to just highlight or speak to anything you would like, or address anything that's in the book that you want to take out of the book in this conversation.
I just wanted to apologize. My cat needed to get out of the door. So.
I'll go first. I think so. We talk about a lot of like the themes and the, you know, with Title IX and the lack of support and where women's football is now. Like we talk about a lot of those serious sides of things, but this book is also extremely entertaining. The women's personal stories and their team stories. I mean, every team is different and has their own, you know, entertaining aspect. And so not only do you get like the serious analytical bit, but there's also a lot of entertaining. You become familiar with these players, you get to know them, you know, through the pages of this book. And I would hope that people who read it end up rooting for them and you know, view them as, you know, friends, I guess would be the best way to put it, because we really tried to put them front and center and personalize it in that way where it's relatable and fun. And so there's that aspect of this book that I don't want to get lost either in the conversation.
Yeah, I would actually build on that, because we're like talking to these players and we end up, there's 2 disputed championships in this game. There are like referees being escorted off the field by police. There are referees being barred from even like officiating in the league anymore. Like all of this exists. And then you have the players who can sit there. I think about one of the parts that gave me like goosebumps was we opened the book talking about those troopers and what happened when they lost their first game, because they played 5 seasons, full seasons undefeated before they ever lost a game. And the team that beat them was a brand new team. It was their first season and it was a shock. And I got chills reporting that, because I talked to quarterback Jan Hines of the Dolls, who like threw the winning pass. And the way she can describe, you know, almost half a century later, she knows who her receiver was. She describes, you know, it as being like seeing like down the end of a straw and all she can see is her receiver. And the other thing that was like so fun about that, there's plenty in here where we're having to take a bunch of really different recollections because memories fade, and sort of with newspaper articles, recollections, and sort of piece together our best guess about like which version of the truth is right. And that winning play is like one of the few things that we have no doubt about, because players from both teams were like, it was a flea flicker pass that won the game. And it got to the point when I was reporting that and I talked to a player and we'd get to that part in the story and I could anticipate that what was going to be said was that they were going to tell me that about the flea flicker. And it was so incredible to hear, like, that game for both the winners and the losers was so resonant that they can all remember it in that detail. And I think it really gets to the heart of like how important this league was to these women. And so many of them only played 2, 3, 4 years, and they almost all describe it as the best years of their lives. And I think that above all, we wanted to honor that and the experience that the women had had, because they've been waiting a really, really long time for someone to ask.
The book's been out about a week now, and I know y'all are having conversations across the country about it. is this media attention or bookstore events like what you're doing with us that's happening now, focusing on the stories of these women and these moments in the games that you capture? Or is it more like this conversation where I'm trying to set a stage so everybody can buy the book from the Country Bookshop, which is linked in here, to discover all these stories. But what, as you're talking about the book, how's it going?
It's been great. The conversations have been fun, and I think different in little ways. And I think we're able to throw different tidbits in there, and some, I guess you could say, are more on the analytical side and whatnot. But then others are more on the player story, the story element side of it. And I think that overall it's been a good mix, and the more we get to talk about it and put the word out there and tell people what it's about, I think it appeals to, I think, for a variety of different people who like the more analytical stuff, but also there's that element of sports, there's heartbreak, there's competition, there's the thrill of winning, and the underdog, there's an underdog story, like all of it's in there.
Rivalries. There's so many rivalries.
You get a lot in this book. You get a lot.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for writing the book and also for taking the time to talk to us in North Carolina today and beyond. And those of you who have come to this video, please share, email it. Sorry, I'm holding the inside of the book. Share it with your friends, talk about it. This is a pretty great book, and it's just the fact that I had never heard of this, not like I know everything, but everybody I've talked to, even in promoting this event, this is just a slice of women's recent history that, as y'all said, was disappearing even as it was happening. And as Brittany said, is happening now. And I just want to thank y'all for writing the book. Thank you especially for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank all of y'all for listening and talking about it and sharing it so that we all know about women's football history in America. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.